how do you teach your children about the natural consequences that happen? And how do we as parents help them to understand? And how do we allow our children just to have those natural consequences? Well, we're going to talk about that. Stay tuned.
You don't want to miss it. You're listening to Marriage Mania, where we are audacious, sagacious, and tenacious for the Lord to uphold godly marriages and to raise fervent children who are countercultural and stand for biblical truth.
Welcome back. I'm Tanya.
And I'm Michael.
And today we're going to be talking about these natural consequences. What does that even mean for our children? These disciplinary methods that we've been talking about the last several podcasts. And we would love for you to check those out if you haven't. But today we're going to talk about these natural consequences and give some great examples around them. But before we get started, please subscribe here. It helps us to get the message out. We really want to reach as many families as possible for Jesus Christ. We also have Bible studies available at marriagemaniaministry.com. These are Bible studies for husbands and wives, the covering the role of a biblical husband and the helper, the role of a biblical wife. And these studies really dig deep on the role that God has for each of us in marriage. And they're so important. It really helps the marriage flow the way God designed it. So check those out at marriagemaniaministry.com. All right. So natural consequences. When I think about that, I'm like, okay, there's so many things that can happen, but how do we teach our children and discipline them regarding these natural consequences? And some of them that I think about are just even little things from toddlers all the way up to teenagers. You know, these natural consequences can happen. And so I was thinking about one just to kind of start the conversation was, you know, our child sometimes will take certain toys to big events, like if we have a big church event or something like that. And it's like a favorite toy. And I'm like, don't take the toy, leave it in the car. And she's like, nope, I'm going to take it. And so I'm like, okay, she takes the toy and loses it and gets very upset and says, Mom, can you please buy me another one? No, that was the consequence. I asked you not to take it because there would probably be other toys and you'll lose it. And so that's a natural consequence. And that's just a small consequence, but there's some other ones that we want to talk about. So Michael, am I on the right track here?
Sounds like it. Yeah. Yes. We're talking, put it in context. We're talking about a continuum of disciplinary techniques for correction that range from the least intense to the most intense, from your praise, presence in your words, to redirecting behavior, to timeouts, to spanking, the gain and loss of privileges. And today we're talking about natural consequences. And it makes me think, you know, the Lord says as we follow his ways, good things happen. As we don't follow his ways, bad things happen. There's some natural consequences of getting off of God's path, that God is trying to keep us from those bad consequences. Those are the reasons why he's trying to direct our behavior on his path, not because he's trying to be mean to us, but because he's a loving God and he disciplines those he loves in order to get us back on his path, because that is the path to life and righteousness and in the end, eternal life. And so, you know, we wanted to direct our children to life and eternal life as well. And part of that can be using natural consequences of their own actions. And you gave some great examples to that. And, you know, sometimes it's best to let natural consequences happen. They forget their lunch. Well, now you're just going to have to go hungry. You know,
that sounds kind of sad, right? But like if they forgot to do something when we already gave them responsibility, which we just talked about in the previous podcast, you know, we've given you responsibility and now you forget your lunch and now you're watching your friends, and I'm sure some of your friends might give you some snacks or something, but you forgot your lunch. And that was a responsibility for you to do, to pack your lunch and get it ready and take it to school or whatever, take it to the library, and then you've forgotten it.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes it's best to let those natural consequences happen. It could be some of the most powerful, impactful lessons that they can make as they make the connection between good decisions resulting in good consequences and bad decisions resulting in bad consequences. And now this is not something that you use all the time. You know, you have to be wise when to let natural consequences teach the lesson. You know, you don't let a child suffer consequences that can have a long-lasting detrimental effect on their life. But if the consequence is temporary and not harmful, like just missing a meal. They won't die. They'll be perfectly fine. It's sometimes best to let these natural consequences occur so the child can see the natural consequences of their bad actions or irresponsible behavior and see the connection between their decisions and the result. And, to use an extreme example, I mean, as far as like, you would never let a child run out into the road without looking, so that when he's hit by a car, he'll learn not to run out into the road again.
That's never do that.
Right. You would use other means to teach your child not to run out into the road without looking, rather than use the natural consequences, because the consequences can be harmful and life changing. So that's where the wisdom comes in. But however, what are some natural consequences that we can use for life lessons, you think?
Oh, I mean, I immediately think about, a teenager driving their car, and they have friends in their car, and they're driving super fast. And here comes a police officer and pulls them over and gives them a ticket. And they're freaking out like, oh my gosh, I just got a ticket. How am I going to tell my parents? Well, there's a consequence, because you were speeding, and now you are responsible to pay for that ticket, and you're responsible to go to court. You're responsible to go to driving school. So these are all the things, because if you don't do those things, now you're going to have an even deeper consequence, because it's a natural thing, and it helps you to abide like, oh man, I shouldn't have been speeding. I should have listened to my parents. Now I've got to pay, I don't know how much tickets are, $200 and some dollars, and that's a lot for a teenager. And I think it's very stressful for them, but it's a natural consequence of not obeying what they should have been doing in the first place.
Right. Because if you as a parent just pay their ticket for them, then they may lose that valuable lesson and end up speeding again, because it's like, well, I know my parents will just bail me out.
Right.
Whereas you could have really hammered the point to have them feel the natural consequences of their actions, and that can keep them from doing that behavior again. I also think of like, if your child failed a test that he didn't study for, an F would probably be a natural consequence you would let happen, rather than argue with the teacher to give a better grade that wasn't deserved. A failed test can be overcome with more intense studying and better grades that result from better studying habits, whereas an undeserved better grade will reinforce the problem of not studying, because a child will think, oh, my parents could just make the teacher give me a better grade.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, because in today's society, we see parents fighting for their children's grades, and there is no consequence. We hear that through, other teachers that we know, where, if they give a bad grade, the parents are right on them and saying, hey, why did you give the F? They shouldn't have got an F. The teenager, the child, is not learning that they are responsible for learning. Like, as a parent, we can't learn for them. They are responsible to learn that material. And if they get an F, it's because of their responsibility, because they have lacked that job to take on to learn. And they basically said, it's not that important, and my parents will get me out of it.
Yes, exactly. Or like forgetting your lunch, to bring your lunch to school. And, your child's not going to die if they miss a meal. But there's some times where it might be beneficial to bring their lunch. If they forget it one time, just bring their lunch, but if it's like a perpetual issue, or you've given them the responsibility, the parent can't just be directing their behavior all the time. Mm-hmm. And some children they get in that habit of and depend on their parents to handle all the things, that sometimes the parent has to take the initiative to really give them, you're old enough now. There's no reason for me to do this. You can make your own lunch, or you can bring your own lunch. You can be responsible for packing your bag. And they need that responsibility to learn how to be more responsible and to learn that independence. Mm-hmm. But that they need to know the consequences of it. Well, if they're just being lax with it and they forget their lunch, it's like, and they call you saying, I forgot my lunch. It's like, well, I'm in the middle of work. I can't take the time out, and you're just going to have to miss a meal today. I'm sorry. And it won't kill them. And the hunger pains may make them be more responsible and determined to bring their lunch in the future, so you don't have to do it every time and remind them for every little thing, which can be tiring as a parent, and is not helpful to the child, because they're not learning to handle more and more things on their own. It also makes me think, forgetting to bring a coat sometimes, and we can get in constant battles with our kids about, it's too cold outside, you need to dress. At some point they've got to be responsible for that, to dress themselves, to wear the proper clothing for the proper conditions. And when we give them that responsibility, if it's too cold outside and they're chilly, and they want a coat and they want you to bend over backwards and stop everything that you're doing in order to get a coat, sometimes it's best to just let the natural consequences happen and say, look, I'm sorry. And I'm sorry you're really cold, but it's like, this is the consequences of not preparing for the cold.
Yeah. We had a friend do that. I remember that. Do you remember that? Where her son was like, came with a t-shirt and it was like winter. And she was like, you need to wear a jacket. He's like, no. So she's like, fine. So he was like freezing outside. I mean, they weren't outside forever, but she's like, that was your decision. You made a decision not to bring your jacket and you're the one that's cold. We're all warm. And, I don't think he ever forgot his jacket after that. It was just like one time.
Right. And here's where the wisdom comes in. Not if they're going to get hypothermia, get them a coat.
Right.
If there's going to be a health issue here.
Right.
But if it's just being uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortably cold and I would rather be warm. And so it's in that category. Yeah. And you're like, well, I need to teach them responsibility and the consequences of action so that they draw those connections. Mm-hmm. So they learn to be more responsible. They learn to govern their own life, and they see the connection between responsible behavior and irresponsible behavior, and they'll be more determined to be responsible in the future. Then that's where you draw that balance. That's when you say, okay, this is a time where the life lesson needs to be made of the actual consequences. It's not going to harm them. They're just going to be a little uncomfortable, and feeling that little uncomfortableness will help teach them the lesson more than any lecture can, that, oh, wow, I was kind of cold and I don't want to be cold in the future. I'm going to remember a jacket next time.
Right. Exactly.
But here's the thing. We want to resist saying I told you so, or giving that impression. Yeah. When and it might be hard to not do that, to kind of gloat, well, I told you so, because I told you should have worn a coat. But that kind of works against what you're trying to do, because you really want the natural consequences to do all the talking. And your great psychologists out there really tried to inspire parents to actually be empathetic when you're using this technique, to really genuinely, if you could do it without being sarcastic, can be really hard, but really empathize. I'm really sorry that you're cold. I'd be cold too. It's kind of chilly out here, and I wish there was something I could do for you, but I'm in the middle of something and I just cannot leave. I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry that you're really cold, but these are the consequences of not preparing for the cold. Mm-hmm. And I'm really sorry about that.
Yeah.
And genuinely empathize with it and just let the consequences do all the talking.
Yeah.
No, you don't want to gloat. That actually works against this method.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably so many examples we can use for natural consequences, and I think like just having this conversation about, this really helps, so others can see, okay, here are some different disciplinary methods that I can use for my child if they're not being obedient, and this helps them to see, like, it's not just our consequence, it's a natural consequence of disobedience. And we are desiring to raise up godly children, godly families, where we really emphasize the disciplinary techniques at home, because if we don't do it, then they're going to learn completely from the culture, and we want to stand out against the culture. And God really tells us in Deuteronomy 6:7 that we are to teach our children at all times, day and night, about the way, no matter what we're doing. It's constant teaching until they get married. And we're still teaching them when they're adults, but they're under their roof of marriage. They're under, a different authority. If they're a wife, they're under their husband. But it's really about teaching wisdom, discernment, and obedience. So I really love this conversation about the natural consequences, because that sounded kind of like, how do you get a natural consequence? But now as we talk about it, there's so many things that happen. And even as adults, we get the natural consequences too when we make decisions that are not according to what God has set for us. So I really appreciate this conversation. You can check out the previous podcasts on the disciplinary methods. And until next time.
God bless.